Hi, I'm Pastor Philip Hoppe. I currently serve as pastor of two churches in Minnesota, but I also served as pastor before that here in Kansas, in Ellsworth, Kansas for 12 years. And I have my own family, my wife and 6 children, and having that family and trying to figure out what to do as a father is part of why I've been looking into this with Dan, this whole area, and thinking about how we best raise up our children in the faith.
And I'm Pastor Dan Galchutt. I serve as the assistant to the district president for missions and stewardship in the Kansas district. And as Phil said, a big driving force for our work has been the desire to teach our children the faith and raise our children up in the faith. I'm blessed. My wife and I, Melissa, are blessed with 5 children, and we really appreciate this opportunity to be with you. I've come to believe that teaching the faith in the home is probably the most important thing for the church to be talking about in 2018 and in the context in which we live. And I would say this for a variety of reasons, but that might be a little bit of a shocking thing for people to hear, because you think about all that's going on around us when we talk about what's going on in our culture, and we see a lot of bad decisions being made in our culture. We see a lot of different things being talked about when it comes to church programs and how to do this thing or how to do that program. There's a lot that people want to talk about. I've become convinced that the most important thing for us to talk about is teaching the faith in the home. And so why is this? Well, number one, God wants us to talk about this. And I think that's very clear. You're going to see that as we talk through this first presentation, and we see what does God have to say about teaching the faith in the home. But then number two, I'd also say teaching the faith in the home is really one of the most effective, if not the most effective ways to retain people in the faith, and especially young people. And I know that's something we think about a lot as educators. We wonder, what's going on with our youth and our children, and where are they really going to be when they leave our Lutheran schools, or where are they really going to be when they're done with confirmation or youth group. I'm convinced that teaching the faith in the home is actually the key to all of this. And just to think about this, I would just say that in my 12 years of being a pastor and teaching confirmation class, I could say without a doubt that the number one factor in how well students did in confirmation was what was going on in the home, right? It wasn't who was the smartest kid. It was basically, are the parents helping out? Are the parents on board with what we're trying to do? And are the parents working with their children? If all those things were true, students did well regardless of how well they could memorize or if they were the smartest kid in the class. They just did well. And I know this is true when I talk to teachers as well. I've got a lot of friends who are teachers in the Topeka area, and they talk about parent-teacher conferences, and they talk about the challenges that we face in the classroom. And they all tell me the same thing. When it comes to parent-teachers conferences, all the parents who are showing up are the ones I don't need to talk to, right? It's the ones who aren't showing up. Those are the ones who I need to talk to. And so I would say that, you educators probably know this to be true as well. When you're dealing with your students, what's going on in the home is probably the number one indicator for how they're doing in school. Right? And I would say it's the same thing in confirmation class. I'd say it's the same thing for youth group, actually. And then I would just say it's actually the same thing then for talking about retaining them in the faith and helping us to raise children and youth into adult Christians. So one of the things that Phil and I really want to talk about and point out is we have been very happy to see over the last 6 or 7 years as we've talked about this. We've noticed that, like, Concordia Publishing House has put out home devotions more and talked about it more, and we've noticed just a greater conversation going on with talking about teaching the faith and parents doing this. However, we do want to, at this point in time, really focus in on the fact that what we're really talking about is, again, the in the home part. Because as we hear a lot about people talking about parents teaching the faith, we still see people missing this most kind of fundamental element of it. And just a few examples of this. It was about a month ago or a few weeks ago, Phil was at a confirmation retreat for his circuit. All the circuit got together and all the pastors taught different things out of the Catechism. And he wasn't teaching the fourth commandment. Another pastor was teaching the fourth commandment. And as this pastor was talking about the fourth commandment, basically what the pastor had to say to the parents was, well, it's your job as parents to get your children to church and to the church activities. And that was pretty much all that was said. Now, we would never deny that that's not important, right? That's obviously important, but there's this gap that we're not talking about. Well, what's going on in the home? What are the parents doing there, right? So that's one example. Another example might be, over the last 2 years since I've joined the district staff, I've become in some ways your quote-unquote typical or normal member of a congregation, although if you talk to Jeff Maltz, he actually says that pastors are very weird, so that's probably not true. I'm not normal in some ways, but what I mean when I say I'm a normal member of a church is that I now go to my home congregation 1 to 2 times a month. I generally don't end up in Bible class for a variety of reasons, and I end up missing a chunk of what my church wants to communicate with me. So I become this kind of normal Christian in American settings where I'm there kind of half the time, maybe a little bit less. And as I thought about it in preparing for the presentations, I thought about what do I hear from my church? And I will say that from my church, probably 80 to 90% of the communication I receive is talking to me about getting my kids to different activities and to different events and to different things going on with the church and with the youth group. And again, those things are good and important, but you think about that, if your quote-unquote normal members are getting whatever, 80 to 90% of your communication is, hey, bring them here and let's do this thing, or bring them to this thing, it really shows how it could easily be that our parents just don't understand what their responsibilities are, what their God-given responsibilities are, because of how we communicate to our families and our people. And then lastly, I'd say here, as we talk about teaching the faith in the home, again, when we're talking about this, oftentimes we'll talk about people teaching the faith in the home, and people hear that, and the first thing they'll say is, yep, that means that we've got to get our kids to church. And again, that's not a bad thing. Obviously we want that, but we want to think about really communicating that, no, parents, father and mother, step-parents, grandparents, if that be the case, that the teaching's really happening in the household. So think about your Board of Education meetings or your teacher meetings. A lot of times we're talking about our events and what we're doing, but we want to talk about what our people are doing, and not just what's going on in the church or in the school, but what's going on in the home. So as we talk about what's going on in the home, I want to just visit with you about this news story. It came out about 6 months ago. Did you all see the news story related to this? If you go to, if you Google it or whatever, back in March, I think it was March 27th, USA Today, I ran across this article about a conversation that was going on about what kind of Disney princess we need next. So who's the next Disney princess going to be, and what should that Disney princess be? And there was a Planned Parenthood organization in Pennsylvania, and this is what they said. They said, we need a Disney princess who's had an abortion. We need a Disney princess who's pro-choice. We need a Disney princess who's an undocumented immigrant. We need a Disney princess who's actually a union worker. We need a Disney princess who's trans. All right? And as we talk about what's going on in our homes, I want to acknowledge that this is obviously a problem, right? Okay, and you can see the most obvious problem, which is really bad ideas out in our culture, in our world, right? But I would submit to you, what's probably the more dangerous problem is that Disney's the one who catechizes our children. That's the most dangerous problem, because If you think about it, why do you have a conversation about who the next Disney princess would be? I mean, forget what was said here. Why do you say, hey, what kind of Disney princess should we have? Well, the reason why you say that is because Disney princesses influence culture, and they influence young people, and they influence minds. So Disney is actually catechizing our children. And it's going on out there. Yes, it's a problem with what these people from this Pennsylvania Planned Parenthood said, but the fact of the matter is, they're not necessarily a part of the church, right? The fact that there are people who have bad ideas out there and who are saying they're bad ideas for the whole world to hear, well, yeah, that's a problem, but we shouldn't expect people who are off base to proclaim the truth, right? So yes, that's a problem, but I would submit to you the bigger problem is Disney catechizes our children. Now when I say Disney catechizes our children, maybe you're already on board with me and you're saying, yep, that's exactly the problem, and so let's talk about it, what do we need to do? If you're there, we're going to talk about what's the best way to counteract this and to handle this. But if you're not there, maybe you're saying, well, I think people kind of know that while Disney's kind of fun, not all their ideas are great. So, that's not really a problem for me or for my family, or it's not a problem for the families I serve. I just invite you to think about this scenario. So imagine your family is perfect, right? You're the perfect family, and you're the kind of family that when you drive down the road on a family trip, the things you're doing is you're saying prayers together in the car, and you're singing hymns, and you're doing all of the right stuff while you're traveling down the road. If you are, good for you, right? Okay, so imagine you're driving down the road, you're doing that with your family, and all of a sudden you see a billboard advertising the next restaurant, and you think to yourself, I'm a little hungry. Where are we going to eat? And what's happened there is that while you were doing a lot of the right stuff, right, something came in, a message came in, and influenced the way you're thinking. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, right, to think about, hey, I'm hungry, I'd like to eat. But my point here is you can't escape the ideas and the inputs that come into us in this world. We live in a noisy culture. Really the noisiest of all cultures, right? If you think about it, how do people refer to the time in which we live? They say we live in the information age, right? You think about there was a Bronze Age, there was an age of imperialism. We live in the information age. And this is incredibly significant, what's going on in our world today. I was looking at my daughter's history textbook, and it identified 10 major milestones throughout all of history. And one of the milestones was information and technology. I mean, we're living through one of the most dramatic shifts in human history, one of the most significant things going on with how our world and how people are changing based off of our information and the information that we receive. So, this time that we live in is radically different than times when people before us lived. I heard it said, and I think it's probably right, somebody said that a student today receives more information or more inputs in one day than somebody who lived in the 1400s did for their whole life. Right? You think about, you jump on the internet, you think about all the information you can find out there and everything you can get, and you think about how much our young people are on the internet or on apps and receiving all of these inputs and everything that's coming in. And this is incredibly significant because information is not neutral. All information conveys, embodies, and argues for ideas. So every time we receive information, every time we receive inputs, we have to deal with it. Just like if you're driving down the road, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be hungry, but when you see the sign, you've got a new input and your mind's got to process it. And this stuff is all around us. And this is why we've got to talk about what's going on and why we need teaching the faith to be happening at home. Because we live in the information age, information argues for ideas, and ideas have consequences, and ideas have legs. They change and shape the world that we live in, or they change and shape us as we live in this world. So I know that the last presenter talked about Christian Smith and his book, Soul Searching. And what I would just like to say to kind of jump off of what he said is that soul searching, I believe, really confirms for us that the way that our young people are catechized is through the information they receive. And again, the vast majority of that, 95% of that, is not coming from you in the church or from you in the school, but it's coming from all kinds of other sources like Disney and like the music they listen to and the stuff they engage online. And this is really what's teaching our children. And just as we think about this, I'll just say that I think people are starting to recognize this problem more and more. I'm hearing for people calling for media fasts. I was reading in preparation for this an interesting article on solitude and leadership. And the guy who wrote this, William Dershowitz, he used to teach at Yale. He has this great quote about the lack of solitude in our world. This is what he says. He says, "Here's the problem with Facebook and Twitter and even the New York Times." So it's not just the new media, it's just the all-encompassing crush of media. "Here's the problem with Facebook and Twitter and even the New York Times. When you expose yourself to those things, especially in a constant way that people do now, older people as well as younger people, you are continuously bombarding yourself with a stream of other people's thoughts. And you are marinating yourself in the conventional wisdom." And this is why Disney's catechizing our children and our media is catechizing our children, is because they get so much information that they end up being marinated in conventional wisdom. Now here's the thing. That's a challenge for us. But the challenge is not necessarily one we can totally escape, right? We can't get away totally, unless you're going to go live in the mountains or something like that. You can't totally get away from the information, and you can't totally get away from bad ideas. And that's why it's really important we talk about what's going on in our homes, and we're talking about intentionally teaching the faith, which Phil's going to talk about now.
One of the concepts that Dan keeps kind of talking about that we've really talked about a lot more just in the last few months, I'd say, really, is this idea of how do we parent in general as parents in our society. We sort of come up with this new term that we use with each other, which is that we kind of have a generation of Uber parents, which means, right, they drive up, they pick up their kids, they take them to another activity, they drop them off there, right? Something happens to them there, right? They're taught academics, they're taught sports, and then the parents come, right? Like an Uber would, pick them back up and take them somewhere else. And what we want to really get about talking about is the fact that that's simply not sufficient, especially with what Dan has just reminded us of, that there's so much information coming in, that if we think we're just going to kind of drop our kids off, and especially in regards to the faith, that we're just going to drop them off at church every once in a while, and that's really going to combat all this other information that they're constantly having put before their eyes and into their ears, it's just not sufficient. And one of the ways I always think about this was, a long time ago I wrote a blog article on this, that I had a youth basketball team that I helped coach. And, it's always kind of funny as you went along in the season, the parents, would kind of get frustrated that their kids were not improving. Somehow by dropping their kids off for 45 minutes with me, right, once a week, their kids were just supposed to end up being NBA-worthy talents, right, in 5th grade. And it was kind of frustrating just as a coach, right? You're kind of like, I'm trying to get some basic things here. No, we're not, running a complex offense yet here in 5th grade or anything. But it really made me think about kind of those two problems with that approach. And one is the simple time element, right? 45 minutes a week was simply not sufficient to move people from one level of skill or education to another level. It just wasn't enough time. And the second thing was, and this is kind of what Dan was talking about before too, is that ultimately, if you really want your kids to get good at sports, have you ever heard these old sports stars, when they talk about their growing up, right? It's not so much that they talked about, I went to this great camp where I did this. No, they talk about their dad going out and throwing the ball around with them over and over again, or going out and shooting hoops night after night till they got a little bit better. Well, that's the kind of thing we think we need in teaching the faith. We need that kind of interaction with parents. One that invests time each day into this task, and secondly, that actually shoots hoops with the kids. One of the things, just in listening to the first presentation, he talked a lot about the modeling of the faith, right? So that when kids are in the home, they see is the Bible being used that sits over there, right? Or do we not really even know what that thing is, right? Do parents get up on a Sunday morning and go to church? But we want to even take that one step further and say, don't just model the faith, teach the faith, right? And in teaching it, you'll also model it, right? If you're going to sit down and teach your kids how to pray or to pray a particular prayer, you're certainly modeling it for them in that moment as well. And so again, these two things that we just do not believe. Dan and I, like a lot of pastors, is always, and I'm sure a lot of you educators have this thought too, right? How do I tweak this? If I just tweak this enough, right, it's finally going to work. Confirmation is finally going to go good. I'm going to come home and say, hallelujah, did that go well today, right? And what we just became convinced is, right, with that 1 hour or whatever that we were given to do that, it just wasn't going to be sufficient. And that's why we both kind of moved away in our thinking from placing the importance just on what the church or what educators do, but to saying that folks at home, the parents, the grandparents, whoever is kind of the head of the household there, needs to shoot hoops at home in regard to the faith. They need to be out there teaching day by day this faith. And we understand this is sort of a scary thought in one way, because we know the state of some of our homes, but we really believe, right, regardless of the state of the homes of the people you're dealing with, right, rather than just saying, oh no, it's terrible, we can't do this, we never could entrust anything to the homes, we got to start entrusting things to the homes, right? And it may take a generation, it may take a couple generations to get this back in the homes and get this going. We really need to stop just saying, well, we can't do it there, and start saying, well, how can we do it there? And there's going to have to be all sorts of kind of stopgap stuff before that, right? That we're going to have to continue in the churches, because not everyone will have a head of the household that's going to do this. So there'll be plenty of work for educators. We're not going to go out of business, right? Pastors, there's going to be plenty of work to do there. But let's start getting the parents thinking about this important task. Let's get them shooting hoops at home, so to speak. Turn back over to Nick.
All right, so we tried to lay out the case for why we ought to teach the faith in the home. But as we think through this, we should acknowledge that God wants us to do this. I mentioned that right off the bat, that we need to acknowledge that this is really the way God set things up. And I'll just say to you, I heard this at a conference a while back, and I really liked it. A guy said that when God created the universe, when he started society, he didn't begin with the government, and he didn't even begin with the church. He began with the family, right? Adam and Eve. The family is the foundational building block of society, and it's actually very, very important to the church as well, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But just as we think about God saying that, hey, yes, parents need to be doing this, let's take a look at some common Bible passages that we go to. One would be Deuteronomy 6. This is what God's Word says to us. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now, Deuteronomy 6 is often cited when people are talking about this, and I would just say that there's a lot to be said, but because of what we're trying to prioritize, I would just like to call to your attention that it says, talk about them when you sit in your house, right? Yeah, it says teach your children, and yes, that happens at church, that happens through the Lutheran school, that happens through youth group, and different things going on there. But Deuteronomy 6 points out the home. Talk about them when you sit in your house, and then look, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house. It's not just teach the faith by bringing them to church and bringing them to church activities. Yes, do that. But really, do this work in your home, in the Christian home. So that's one of the really popular verses that people reference when we talk about teaching the faith and doing that in the home. Another one's Ephesians 6. We're not going to look up that one, but we are going to skip ahead now to Psalm 78. It's another really well-known one when we talk about teaching the faith or in the home or in the family. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done. He has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children. So again, here in Psalm 78, God's word really focuses on this parent-child relationship. Fathers are given to do this, to teach to their children. Parents are given this work and this responsibility to teach their children. It's not just, as Phil talked about, an uber parent situation, or as the pastor mentioned at the confirmation retreat. The fourth commandment doesn't just tell parents, get your kids to church. I mean, it does tell them that, but it tells them more than that. And we need to, as church workers, as servants of the Lord, we actually need to impress this upon the people whom we serve. We need to remind parents of what God gives them to do. And now I want to talk to you about a passage that we don't go to quite as often when we talk about teaching the faith in the home. This is Exodus 13. I'll maybe set this one up just a little bit. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. The reason why we don't talk about this one quite as much is because Moses is talking to the people of Israel about the consecration of the firstborn, right? And so when we're dealing with the consecration of the firstborn, there's death and blood involved for the animals and all that stuff. And so we don't talk about it as much. But I actually think that Exodus 13 really helps us to see how God expected it to work for the people of Israel, and undoubtedly then how he expects it to work for us and for our people as well. Because what happened when God instituted the Passover, when God instituted the consecration of the firstborn and was teaching all of his laws and his commands, is he would reference the fact that you're going to do this in your home. Your family's going to do this. And when you do this, because it's different, your son's going to come and ask you. And you, as a father, as a parent, are going to give them the answer. But I really want to focus on the first half of that verse, which, God acknowledges, if you do this tradition, right? If you think about it in terms of like some of our Christmas traditions or something like that, if you do this tradition, eventually your son's going to come and ask you, why do we do this thing? Why do we do this thing in our house? And the answer there isn't like, well, I don't know. Or the answer isn't, go talk to pastor or to your DCE or to your Lutheran school teacher, right? The answer there is for the parent to give the answer, right? The parent says why we do what we do, and really it shows that all the way back in Exodus, God expected us to be working through the family. Again, the family is the foundational building block of society. It's actually the foundational building block of the church as well. I mean, Christ is the cornerstone, but it's really the families that build up our church. And I'm going to reference a book in my second session, but I'll just give you a little bit of a heads up about it now. There's this book written by Mary Eberstadt, who's a Catholic lady, and she wrote the book, How the West Really Lost God. And she basically says in that book that we've long thought that the church is good for families, right? Because the church teaches God's truth, the church teaches morality, and so the church helps the family is kind of the theory out there. And what she found is she really looked into things, and she found that we kind of missed the fact that families help the church. That strong families build a strong church. And she actually says then, in answer to her book, How the West Really Lost God, she says, more so than the church went downhill, the family went downhill. And when we lost the family, we actually lost God that way. And that references all the challenges that we see in the West and in our country about a declining participation in the church. So again, we've somehow lost sight of this, and we've somehow lost sight of the fact that it's really what parents are doing in the home that's vital, maybe the most crucial thing, along with bringing children and youth to church. But what parents are doing in the home is really the most important thing. It's what God sets up, and I believe, once again, it's how we're going to retain our young people in the faith. So now Phil's going to talk about other reasons we should teach the faith in the home.
Put a quote up there, but it'll take me a second to get there. First, kind of a question to you is, who do you think usually puts a catechism in the hands, a small catechism in the hands of a kid? Who's usually the first one to do that, maybe? The teacher? Yeah. Maybe a DCE, maybe a pastor, maybe, right, some layperson that might be helping out with confirmation. And I always think it's a little bit odd, right, that we hand them this book, small catechism, and they open it up, right, and at the top, what does it say? As the head of the household should teach his family. Right? And we're kind of like, well, then why isn't dad, or if it's mom that's the head of the household at that time, or grandma, right, whoever is kind of playing that role at the time, why aren't they the ones giving this book, right? I mean, we know even just the history of the small catechism, right? We all know its kind of form, right? Question and answer. And that part of the reason for that way of doing it was to say, right, Luther wanted to any parent to be able to teach the faith to their child. And he didn't really care if they knew anything at all about the faith. He wanted to give them a resource that they could still do it. So if they truly did not even understand what the 10 Commandments were, they could say, what is the first commandment? And then they could say it together. And they could say, what does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. Right? So that they literally didn't have to have any knowledge. They could just open up the catechism, read a question, read an answer. And again, we've talked about part of the thing that is scary about moving towards an approach of trying to get families to do more is that we think, oh no, I don't know if they can do it. I don't know if our families that we're dealing with, we may even say, right, if we're honest, our families, not just the families we're dealing with, but our families in our own home, are we prepared to do this on a daily basis? Well, Luther seemed to have this idea. Give resources that are so simple that literally anyone can do it. And that's part, in our second part, we're going to kind of show you that one of the resources we put together. And we had a very similar approach there. That we wanted it to be simple enough that we could just simply give it to somebody and say, do this. Right? That we didn't have to say, okay, you better go take a 10-week class before you start or anything like that. Here's just some things you can start tomorrow in your home. But so yeah, the catechism, the small catechism, it tells us this central, document that helps teach us the faith, tells us in this sort of understated way, well, parents are supposed to be teaching the faith, just like all those verses that Dan showed you there. Now, in the large catechism, right, the large catechism, Luther is here expounding on the same content that's in the small catechism, but he's expounding on it. And this quote is there as he's talking about the fourth commandment. Now, Luther in the whole fourth commandment has been talking about, okay, here's what children are to do in respect to their parents. They're to be obedient, they're to be submissive, they're to honor their father, they're to love and cherish them, all these things. And then he says, it would be good though here if we also talked a little bit about what parents' responsibility is to their child. And if we admit, probably a lot of times when we teach the fourth commandment too, we tend to just focus, because that's how it's worded, right? Honor your father and mother. And we just talk about that. But we don't talk a lot about, well, okay, not only, yes, we honor them because God has told us. We honor them because they're God's representatives to us. But also, we honor them because God has given them a holy work to do. And this is what Luther says. He says, he has given and entrusted children to us with the command that we train and govern them according to his will. Otherwise, God would have no need of father and mother. Just that part alone, right? He's saying God wouldn't need moms and dads if it weren't to train up children in the faith. We'll talk here in a second. We kind of flip this sometimes, right? We think that other people should be doing that teaching the faith work, and we should be more concerned with like putting food on the table, right? But he says no. If God could say, what's the one thing, first thing of importance that God gave mom and dads to do, that's it. And then there's this phrase which maybe seems a little over the top at first. He says, therefore, let everyone know that it is his chief duty, on pain of losing divine grace, to bring up his children in the fear and knowledge of God. It's the chief duty of parents to raise children in the faith. And when we think about that, then he says, right, he kind of puts it another way, where he's going to point out to us if we're not doing this, well, this then is sinful of a parent not to do this. When we show you our resource, at the bottom of that resource was kind of some reasoning on the front page that it's a lot of stuff we've been sharing with you. But what's interesting there is that at the end I put there, well, what if you haven't been doing this? And all of a sudden you realize you should, or you realize you should and you did good for a day and then not so good for 3 days, or good for a week and then not so good for 3 days. What should you do? And I just simply put there, right? Confess that to the Father. Be forgiven. Be raised up to newness of life. And one of my fellow pastor friends, he had taken it, he was kind of doing some typos, corrections for me. But he put out to the side there, is this a little too strong? Should we really say that we need to confess this as a sin if parents aren't doing this work? And our answer is yes. What's the good news? We can confess it, because we'll be forgiven, right? It's not just bad news. Yes, it's a terrible sin, and therefore you should feel awful. No. But it is that important that we need to say, if this is the chief duty of parents and we're not doing it, well, then we for sure need to take the time to say, let's confess this to God. Let's be forgiven and understand all that God would have us do there as he raises us up with his Spirit to go about and do this work. Again, one other place in the large catechism, he just says, right, parents are God's representatives. In other words, this is how God has decided to do this work. He could have done anyways, right? He could have had giraffes teach children the faith if he wanted to, right? Maybe sometimes would have done better than parents, right? But he didn't. He decided to have parents do this work. And even if, again, we think sometimes God's plan, especially in our modern context, we think, oh, I don't know, God, that doesn't sound wise, right? Maybe we as a church take it on. We as educators, we just try to bear that whole load. And no, instead, right, we say, this is what God has given us to do. This is how he's chosen to do it. So let's try to both ourselves and then to encourage others to live in this order, this structure that God's given, rather than do something else and then complain that it doesn't work. Right? We do this a lot with God, right? It's his ways, and we say, I think it'd be better over here. I'm going to do it this way. It'd be a little easier for me, or fit how I like to do things better. And then all of a sudden, wait, that's not working, right? It's not even accomplishing the thing which I hoped it would. Well, let's go back to God's ways and let him show us how to do these things that he created. He might know something, right? Kind of as a way to not wrap up this part, but to kind of come back at it again, is this simple passage, right? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. This passage has always sort of driven me nuts just at a basic logic level, a basic experience level. Because I don't know about you, but when I first hear it, I always think, now, wait a second here. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense, God, if I take care of all these things, these earthly things that need to happen, right? That's what he's talking about there. Food, clothing, shelter. I think I'm actually fairly decent at that, making sure I have that and I can have these basic things. And God, quite frankly, I think you'd do a lot better if you took care of your kingdom stuff, right? It's your kingdom, you know everything about it, so why don't you kind of do that directly, and I'll work over here in the realm of the earthly life. But God says, nope, flip it. And in one sense, this just, I hope, kind of blows our mind. That God says, you focus first on my kingdom stuff, and I'll make sure you have food and clothing and house and home. And we want to, so what? I'm just supposed to work at church all day and not have a job? No, okay, but still, I think God knows our tendency is to think that that's our realm, is this earthly stuff. Not to mention we get then really worried about providing it, right? That's a whole other issue. But he knows that we think that's our realm, and so he says this to us. No, my kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom. And really what Martin Luther's doing in the fourth commandment, he doesn't list this verse, but if he's not thinking about it, he should be when he writes, because he basically says this. He says, as parents, we know these things. We say, okay, I've got to make sure my kids have this and that, right? School started not too long ago, right? Does it feel like it's already been months and months, or how does it feel for you guys? I don't know. When we're getting ready for school, right, we get these lists. Here's what you need to get your kid, right? Get them, this many pencils and this many Kleenex boxes and all these kind of things. And, it's actually something we feel pretty good about. We're like, I might actually be able to get that done, right? And go to Walmart and check all these things off. And we tend to think that's what we're supposed to do. And then in our modern world, especially our affluent modern world that we're blessed to live in America, right? And then we start thinking, well, okay, but not just food and clothes, but the best education, the best sports programs. I got to get them ready for college, and I got to save money for college. And we think all of this stuff is the most important thing we do, is to provide for the physical well-being of our children. And again, God says, nope, right? I'll make sure that stuff happens if you'll make sure that you're keeping the kingdom first. And I don't mean that in some just like mechanical way, like he's not going to give you those things if you don't do this, right? But he says in terms of priority, that when we look at our children, the first thing again we should say is, do they have spiritual food rather than physical food? Right? And they say, oh, what about, I can't even think what it is now, what's the hierarchy of needs? Who's that guy? Anybody? Help me out with the name. Huh? Maslow. Thank you, Maslow. We say, well, wait a second here, right? No, we got to make sure this. And it's not to argue against that theory. It's to say God's going to take care of this stuff down here that's needed, but you make sure, first and foremost, that you are looking at the spiritual needs of your children. And so, again, we want to then encourage people to take up this work that God gives to parents. I almost said it there, pastors. See, that's bad. I was hoping you guys would have caught me if I said that. Say, no, you haven't been listening to your own presentation. Gives this work to parents. And part of this is, we kept saying, we don't want to say, don't bring them to church. That's not our point. I'm a pastor. I'd probably get in a lot of trouble if that's what people left here saying was. These guys said, don't worry about you bringing your kids into church. Do that. But even when you're there, parent them in church. Right? Show them the hymnal. Show them whatever you're using, right? Teach them when we're praying. Say, hey, fold your hands, right? All these little things. And don't get me wrong, I'm up front, so if this is the point where I should have my wife up here, who's much better at doing this than me, because I just go sit up front and say, have fun with the 6 kids, wife. But, right, to constantly be doing, even when we're in church, that we're not just passive there in regards to our kids and just say, oh, finally someone else can teach them. I mean, God has given us pastors to teach us, so that's good there too, but we're even training there, but then especially when we get back into the home, we do this. Whenever I give this presentation, my conscience gets a little bit scarred, right? Because I know my home, and I think I even joked with Dan, I said, I hope nobody asked me how many times the last week, Pastor, have you done family devotions with your family, and how many times did it go just perfectly, right? I think this is a hard thing to do, especially since it hasn't been a habit. But again, if our conscience is bothering us, that we're not doing this work, that's just the work of the Spirit, calling us to repentance. And again, we don't just have to go away going, oh, I'm such a terrible parent. No, we say, God, I haven't done real good at this. Please forgive me. And then blessedly, right, every time he says, you're forgiven. Right? I love you. It's gone as far as the east is from the west. Now I'm going to raise you up. Now go about this work again. And when we're talking to our people that have been entrusted to our care, whether it's as a pastor, an educator, or DCE, right, I think sometimes when we talk about this to them, which is something we hope you will do, we hope you'll try to take some of this into your own home. But we know one of the things you guys have been given through your calls, through your work, is to talk to other families and to kind of encourage them in this way. And again, some of them might actually go, yeah, you're right, I probably should do that, and I probably haven't done it that well. And so now, what do I do? Don't ever forget to give them the call to repentance and the hope of the gospel. Give them that time and time again. Even if they're, the other thing is some people might say, well, what if my kids are, they're high schoolers now. We haven't done this our whole life. Well, same deal. Confess that, right? And with older kids, one of the best things I think parents can do is to go to their kids and say, guys, I've really come to a realization that I didn't have, which was how much I should have been doing this, and I haven't. So we're going to have to bring this to God again, let Him forgive us. Now we're going to get at this work. And yeah, it would have been better if we started when you were here, right, than if you were here. But this is the great part about God's grace and forgiveness, right? It always can be a new beginning. It always can be a new start, no matter what we've done. So in conclusion, we want to leave some time here at the end to get some of your questions. And if you don't have questions, we have a few that we might throw at you to engage a little bit with you. But just in conclusion, this first section of kind of why it is that we think this is so important, right, is one, because there are so many other sources of, he used the word catechesis in there, of training, of inputting information into us. This is all around us. And so, and like Dan said, if different parents do this a little differently, how much they try to guard those children, and that'd be a whole different presentation. But even if you try your best to guard them from anything harmful in our world, it's everywhere, like Dan said, right? Drive down the road and continue to look at that and see all those things that are there. So that's the first part, is that we have to look at this and say, there's all these other inputs that are there. And then we say, okay, what's the solution to that? And we say, shoot hoops at home with your kids in regards to the faith. Get in there, do the actual training of the faith in the home. If you don't know anything, use the simplest resources. If you know more, good, right? Use that in every way you can, but continue to do this and continue to look at this, because we really need to get to the point where we are getting parents back to doing this work, starting with us, parents in our homes, each individuals, but helping the church recognize this as well. So don't be, right, just the uber parent that just drops people off and says, well, I hope, right, this might help, and I hope my, person that doesn't have a lot of maturity in faith will be able to grow in maturity in faith. Actually take the time to encourage that in the home.